It's my joy and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Samantha Reifer. She's in here from Colorado. Colorado, as you know, has a fairly diversified and interesting energy landscape, and Sammy has a pretty diversified and interesting background. She has worked in the public sector in the energy office in Colorado, and then she has gone on to the private sector now as she works at Scale Microgrid, which she will talk to you about. But somewhere in between, she managed to grab a little experience helping the cannabis industry save energy. So it's one of those rare experiences that I thought that I would define Sammy. So when she's not busy changing the world and working on energy issues, she's outdoors in Colorado. I don't know anybody from Colorado who is not an outdoors person. And so it's a pleasure to have Sammy here. She's going to be talking about building the backbone of the 21st century grid with microgrids.
All right. So California is facing an existential problem in that it has a lot of vulnerable infrastructure that is being exacerbated by climate change. California needs to figure out how to rebuild a safe, reliable, and cost-effective grid for its constituents. This grid is essentially a large power plants that have to deliver power to distant and sparse loads through miles of lines that run through dense forests that are increasingly more flammable due to climate change and deferred forest management. While this is coming to a head in California, this is not a problem specific to the state. Nationwide, our grid has been tested by hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and squirrels, and has failed. And with the amount of power outage events being caused by extreme weather doubling between 2003 and 2012. Currently, policymakers are reactively solving each energy crisis with more complexity and regulation to the grid. Today, I want to talk to you about a proactive solution for grid management that will add more flexibility to the system. In addition to climate change, our system is also being challenged by an increase in renewable resources and their intermittent generation profiles that are requiring more resources that can ramp up and down quickly to help balance the grid. This variation can help be managed by distributed energy resources, or DERs. DERs are load and generation resources that are located on the distribution grid. They are often referred to as grid edge technologies because they typically reside on the customer side of the meter. One subset of DERs are microgrids. Microgrids aggregate generation and load resources within a specific territory to operate as a singular system. Microgrids perform the same benefits as power plants, but it can also do more, such as energy storage and economizing the deployment of that storage. Microgrids serve customers and the macrogrid at large, but most importantly, microgrids are islandable in that they can provide power during larger macrogrid outages. This room could be a microgrid, this building could be on a microgrid, or a microgrid could serve the larger community. Microgrids reduce dependency on landlines or long transmission lines. They allow for local communities to have more control over their power infrastructure, and they also increase the resiliency of the grid through redundancy. The current barriers for microgrids are the fact that the physical grid and the regulatory structure are built around this top-down, one-way power flow system that is managed at the transmission level, which has made microgrids complex, time-intensive, and expensive to develop. Without intervention, this one-way power flow system will continue, and microgrids will have to balance competing interests between their customers and the grid. For example, batteries will have to decide whether to deploy their load for peak load for their customers or grid capacity requirements. In addition to the competing interests, the sheer complexity will eventually start to overwhelm grid operators as the amount of people who can aggregate and bid DERs into the grid grows from dozens to hundreds across each distribution system. So how are we proactive? Through a mechanism called layered decentralized optimization, where the transmission and distribution systems are broken into tiers, and each tier is responsible for the reliability and optimization within its area. So for example, the distribution system would aggregate supply and demand, and to the extent possible with DERs, therefore maximizing the utilization of those resources. And then it would take all excess supply and demand and bid it to the TSO. This distribution system could be broken into further tiers by microgrids. And so instead of the DSO managing every DER, microgrids would manage the resources in their territories and then aggregate excess resource generation and load resources embedded to the DSO. This would greatly reduce the complexity of the grid, and it would maximize DERs, microgrids, and their aforementioned value propositions. But there's a lot of political reform that's required to get to this distributed managed system. Even without policy reform, Scale Microgrid Solutions is still building the backbone of this grid of the future. By building behind-the-meter singular customer systems, we are able to avoid a lot of the policy barriers that brought down other projects. In addition to this regulatory structure, we have also productized our microgrids, and we are also able to offer financing, design, build, and operate services for our turnkey microgrid products. This allows us to unlock additional value in cost savings and efficiencies that we can offer to our customers, and that allows us to remain competitive within sticky regulatory environments. So with the rise of renewable energy, the new grid demand, and all the strains from climate change, DERs are coming to the grid with or without the help of the state. What we're really talking about here is, are we going to be proactive about building a grid that can maximize these resources and their benefits or obscure them? Thank you.